Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond, with your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barley.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barley with you for the next half hour as we talk about some of the stories of British Columbia. And usually we go to, some gold mine or some ghost town or something. But today we're going to fly the flag here today. Now this would be a fine tablecloth, wouldn't it? It's a CPR.
Yep.
Right way up because the red square always goes in the middle.
Right.
And this flew over Okanagan Lake and many of the lakes of the interior, starting when?
Okanagan Lake, Kootenay Lake, the Arrow Lakes, so on.
Yeah.
And the CPR actually was, the lakes were the highways. Before there were any railways in the country, in certain parts of the country, they couldn't go in.
Yep.
Slocan Lake was a typical example, Okanagan Lake in many instances as well. So they used those water highways to carry freight, to carry passengers, and really to counter the Great Northern Railway, making some intrusions into British Columbia as well.
Now the Great Northern, how close was it getting about 1900? Because is that about when the CPR started its work?
Yeah, that's about the time that James J. Hill, the empire builder of the Great Northern, looked at British Columbia as an avenue of great wealth for him as well as for his line. And the CPR was aware of this under Van Horn, and decided to counter with lake boats down those major lakes to blunt the thrust of the Great Northern Railway.
Now, some places, when we did our stories in past years about the Sternwheelers on Kootenay Lakes, there were actual Great Northern steamers on there, and they had races and stuff.
Sure.
But the Great Northern never got onto the Okanagan.
No, it didn't. It was a little too late for the Okanagan. The CPR beat them to it. There's not much doubt about that. But other people have beaten the CPR to it. I mean, old Captain Shorts, who was really a legend on Lake Okanagan, he rode the lake in a big kind of a rather long boat that he managed to row by himself for 3 years.
He rode the lake.
And
you mean he just with 2 long sweeps?
Manual power.
And what did he carry? Did he carry everything in this boat?
He carried everything in that boat, Mike. He would carry all sorts of merchandise. He would carry liquor. He would carry lumber. He would carry anything. Made $6,000 in 3 years. Banked $6,000. That was a lot of money. And did so well that he decided to launch into a stern wheeler or steam wheeler. He was wrong, and he said if our foresight was as good as our hindsight, we'd raise hell, wouldn't we? and went broke in a grand way.
Was he philosophical about going broke, or?
Yeah, he was. He eventually went to the Yukon, disappears up there, tried to make his fortune up there, did not make his fortune, returned to die in the Yale area at about 84 years old.
So there was a vigorous freighting business on the Okanagan, even if it was just one guy sweeping on oars, before the CPR came on here.
Oh yeah, sure there were. A bunch of entrepreneurs were out there trying to make a living, and some doing quite well, like Shorts. And remember, there were only 5 major towns, and the CPR serviced these. I'll mention a few of the ships after. Vernon, of course, which wasn't right on Okanagan Lake, but still was connected to Okanagan Lake through Okanagan Landing. And then Kelowna was a major town at the center of the of Okanagan Lake, which is about 70 miles long. Then Summerland, which we call Lower Summerland today.
Some people call Trout Creek. Was it right down there?
Yeah,
or was it a little north
actually
of Trout
north
Creek?
of Trout Creek.
Okay.
The old pilings are north of Trout Creek itself. And then you went down to Penticton, which was at the foot of the lake, and that was orchard land and owned by individuals like Tom Ellis. And then away down the valley, still connected because a lot of the supplies for Fairview, which was still going at the turn of the century, kind of limping along, Mike. But so those were the 5 major towns in the Okanagan. And the CPR launched a number of undertakings on Okanagan Lake. First, of course, they had the York was there. Then the Aberdeen, which and this shot gives you an example of how the Aberdeen looked. Classic sternwheeler lines, very, very nice ship. Not as big as some of the later vessels that were to ply the waters of the lake, Mike.
Okay, and those would be the Okanagan and eventually.
Yeah, the Okanagan and eventually the queen of them all, the SS Sicamous.
Okay, we're going to talk about that as Gold Trails and Ghost Towns takes a look at the Sternwheelers of the Okanagan right after this break. Welcome back. We're talking about the Sternwheelers of Okanagan Lake. Well, they were all CPR Sternwheelers, and we've got a few to go through. Some of the, I mean, after we've talked about that, we've got to talk about some of the characters too, because they are remarkable. Yeah. What was it a plum for people to be assigned to be the captains of Sternwheelers in the Okanagan?
Mike, it was more than that. They were the most esteemed individuals in town. Ranged far above the doctors and the lawyers and every other of the social strata in town. They were considered their own masters. They guided the most famous vessels on the lake, naturally. And when I think of the old captains on Okanagan Lake, there are Captains North and McLeod and various others, but probably George Ludlow Estabrooks, who was captain of the Aberdeen when it was launched in 1907, and then was later captain of the Sicamous, comes to mind. And here's a picture of Estabrooks. And the Estabrooks family runs through that Sternwheeler. They're in Sternwheeler history all through the province of British Columbia. And the later captain who became almost persona with the SS Sicamous, and this is Captain Joe Weeks. Mm-hmm. And Joe Weeks, he was signed on as a cabin boy, I think at about 14 years old. Later was captain or master of the Aberdeen, then master of the Okanagan, finally master of the SS Sicamous, and that was about 1922.
And this is his hat.
That is his hat.
Now, did Joe Weeks let you have this hat, or how did you come
I knew Joe Weeks very, very well, and an old friend of his, who's an old friend of mine, made sure that hat was sold to me some years ago. Now, and it is really quite classic.
To be the captain of the Queen of the Fleet was something special, because there were several CPR boats on at the same time. I mean, they overlapped. The Okanagan and the Sicamous were on together.
Well, somewhere in about 1916, there was kind of a depression in the country. They laid a lot of them aside. And remember, the railway was here by then. The Kettle Valley Railway was here, but that didn't affect the SS Sicamous. And the SS Sicamous really achieved and earned the title of the Queen of Lake Okanagan. And there's not much doubt about it. When you look at it, it carried 500 passengers, Mike, or more. In a tight fix, they could probably carry 600. There was brass. Its staterooms had teak, and it had hardwoods of all types. It had mahogany. It had cedar. It had stained glass. It had cut glass mirrors. It had all the CPR. China.
Look at this. This is a beautiful piece. Where is this particular hotel?
Well, actually, that was an old hotel at the end of Bernard Avenue, which was standing when I was a kid. Yeah. And that's the old Lakeview, owned by a very famous gambler out of the Kootenai country, a guy called Jim Bowes. And Jim Bowes used to receive the passengers and give them a very, I think a very good meal and very good lodging for a reasonable price, probably $1.50.
Along with the china came the silverware.
Sure.
And anybody who ate in the main salon, I guess, got this kind of treatment. That was
superb treatment.
Everybody talks about how spectacular the service was in the restaurant.
Yeah, I think those people who traveled on the Sternwheelers, whether it was the Minto or the Moye or the SS Sicamous or the Aberdeen, they really never forgot it. It was a unique experience. You were traveling alone, essentially, with everyone else on board that ship. You were gliding up a lake, usually in good weather, usually in the daytime. So you saw the Okanagan at its pristine best. You know, the waters were blue, and there was no pollution, and there were very few people around. A couple of small towns on the shores, and you'd stop at various places along the route. You'd stop at what we call Lower Summerland. You'd stop at Peachland, stop at Wilson's Landing, Okanagan Landing, Kelowna, and all the rest. And a very leisurely pace of life. Tough times, though, Mike. Hard scrabble times, you know. Some of the people were launching orchards. There were ranchers doing relatively well in good years, not so well in other years.
I read some great stories that during the heyday of the Okanagan, the big boom between 1910 and 1914, they were selling land everywhere, and you had to elbow your way past the land agents that were aboard these Sternwheelers. Yeah. They were the chief population, perhaps.
Yeah, well, and that story goes on to say that, you know, the speculators or land dealers who were promoting the Okanagan didn't have much difficulty. Guys like Robinson, of course, who promoted land in Summerland and then across in Naramata and various other parts of the Okanagan. had not much difficulty promoting the Okanagan. Good climate, leisurely pace of life.
So the only problem, you never had to face a problem. You never had to try and keep a straight face while trying to sell property in the Okanagan.
No, it wasn't difficult.
It wasn't a tough row to hoe. So all of these people are aboard these Sternwheelers.
Yeah.
Did they drop in at all of these landings every day, or was there some kind of signal? Did a person put up a bonfire or a flag? Or
no, there was a set route, Mike, and sometimes in the more remote areas they would have a certain signal. Sometimes they put up a bonfire, sometimes they put up a white flag, and so on. That varied with the Okanagan Lake or Arrow Lakes and Kootenai Lake. Those are the major three. And but people were serviced. They were serviced extremely well. They would nudge into shore to pick up 10 boxes of apples.
Well, that's why the boat, I guess, was designed. The ship, was designed the way it was because it did have to beach regularly.
Yeah.
And the stern wheel actually was what allowed it to do that, because it created a new water level when it wanted to get offshore.
Sure, and they could back out easily. And it made it was an ideal boat, really an ideal boat, and didn't draw much water, as you well know. So well conditioned to the inland lakes of British Columbia. And that's why the SS Sicamous traveled so long. I mean, it traveled from 1914 till 1935. Then they took off the third deck in 1935, hoping, because the business had slipped significantly, center of the Depression, right in the dead center, right in the middle of the Depression, and the CPR elected to take off that third deck, which I think was a mistake, because it had that classic wedding cake design. And here's an example of how it did look in its heyday, and I think it had graceful lines. This particular photo was just taken off Kelowna when it's coming across the lake with the West Bank Indian Reserve on the other side. And it shows the classic lines of, and really there's no other sternwheeler that compares with it, with the exception of the Nasukan maybe. And that was the old ship that came out of Nelson. It was a sister ship essentially, both of them just over 200 feet long, and really quite remarkable.
Yeah. Now these, in addition to being the land agents and the other characters who would be on board these things, it strikes me that we had a gentry in the Okanagan who would travel, who came here and tried to turn this into their little piece of civilization.
Oh yeah, sure. And one name always comes to mind. That's Captain Dunwaters. And Captain Dunwaters now was a unique and singular character, Mike. Really quite unusual, even for the Okanagan that was covered with remittance men. And Captain Dunwaters had made his fortune as the publisher of the Scotsman, and the Scotsman was one of the major paper, I believe, in Edinburgh. And he'd sold out for a spectacular amount of money and decided, for some reason, to settle in the Okanagan and establish his own estate. And a vast estate it was, thousands of acres. He called it Fintry. And that was across the lake from Kelowna and up slightly.
That is the delta of one of the rivers, and it's to this day beckons people.
Oh, it's a marvelous piece of property.
What did he do there?
Well, he lived like a prince. He hunted when he wanted to. He entertained lavishly. Occasionally he would go to town, and he was usually shabbily dressed. I don't know why. He was a strange duck, as they say. And I remember once, there's a famous story that goes around Kelowna. Meikles, an old name in Kelowna, used to have a kind of a general store down on Bernard Avenue. And they carried everything, right from ladies' fashions right to farm supplies. And they had a number of new clerks that would turn over occasionally. And old Dunwaters came into Meikles one day, and he waited around for 10 minutes, and then he waited around for 15 minutes and 20 minutes. And finally, the junior of junior clerks came. Nobody recognized him and said, "Yes, can I help you?" He said sniffily. And Dunwaters said, "Yes, yes, you can." "Well, what would you like?" And he said, "I'd like some barbed wire." Well, he said, "How many feet would you like?" Dunwaters paused for a moment and said, "I'll start out with 2 boxcar loads."
He was going to fence the entire 1,000 acres. Well, that must have caused the young clerk to suck wind there.
Yes, he became quite well known. And a classic maneuver he pulled off in Vancouver, unlike Dunwaters, who wasn't really mean-spirited. He was really quite a decent man. But he was carrying on in a hotel in Vancouver, and I can't remember the name of it, but one of the, maybe it was the Balmoral, I'm not sure, but it was one of the old hotels in Vancouver, in early Vancouver. And he was mixing it up with some pretty tough characters. And they were raising a bit of hell in the hotel and getting very disorderly. And the bartender, who acted as bouncer as well, a huge man, warned Dunwaters 3 or 4 times that if he didn't behave himself, he'd throw him out. And Dunwaters ignored him completely, of course, which was Dunwaters' way. And finally, he picked Dunwaters up by the scruff of the neck and the seat of the pants and threw him right out the door. I'm not even sure he opened the door, but anyway, he went through the door, landed on the sidewalk in his hands and knees, actually, and looked back bleary-eyed at the bartender and said, "I'll have your job." Well, the bartender had heard this one before. He said, "Yeah," he said, "you're no good." He says, "I never want to see you in this place again." He says, "I'll be back." Next day, a very spiffy-looking gentleman walks in the door, completely sober. Bartender looks at him. Seems vaguely